on successful longevity. We had a nice panel in the community yesterday at church in Killarn, and I just asked the question, because it was a more or less completely lay audience, how many people had heard of the Institute for Successful Longevity? About half the hands went up. So we still have some work to do to get our name in front of the public. The best way to describe the Institute is in terms of its goals, its mission statement. So really, what we're here to do is, we're a science institute. We're trying to understand the mechanisms of age-associated disorders, particularly functional, and we have a specific interest in cognitive decline. We also are trying to do something about it. So we don't want to just find out what goes wrong. We want to find out what's the best way to mitigate those sorts of changes. So developing the best, and the word was chosen, I think, intentionally, the best holistic interventions. No one discipline is going to be able to solve it on its own. The other thing, obviously, and what we're doing here today, is to disseminate the knowledge that we acquire to the community, to aging adults, and we're happy to have a few aging adults in the audience, and also to their caregivers. And we think if we do this well, we can cultivate the scientific, social, and political leadership on this issue that we hope will engage our country. So we want to be a leader in this new field. Okay, what aren't we as an institute? So I like this particular cartoon. It's based in part on a Twilight Zone episode many years ago called Kick the Can. And for those of you who remember back to it or have seen it on Netflix, it had a group of older adults sitting rocking on chairs, deciding they didn't want to be older adults in that sense, and they started to engage in all kinds of fun activities. And at the end, you see them leaving the scene as little children again. How many of you want to be little children again? Usually no hands go up on that. So we've done that and so on. So that's not what we do. All right, what do we mean by successful longevity? Well, we think when an individual across their lifespan is able to set, pursue, and hopefully reach their goals, that's successful longevity. It doesn't depend entirely on how long you live, but what you're able to do while you do live. When you can accomplish that, you have a very high quality of life. And we have kind of two approaches we've taken. One of them is kind of the planning and prevention aspect. We want to ensure people reach their older ages in the best possible physical and mental health. That involves avoiding things like, wear a seatbelt in case you do get into a crash, because it'll help, that type of thing. Build up physical and cognitive reserves. Exercise, great thing to do at all stages of life. And perhaps mentally stimulating activities will contribute. However, we know impairments develop. When they do, we want to be able to restore function, either through rehabilitation, compensation. Particularly, we're interested in technological approaches, interventions. We want to augment your abilities, and in the cases where we can't repair, find good substitutes for those abilities. That brings me now to our speaker, because part of successful longevity is avoiding exactly what she's going to talk about, elder abuse. Karen Roberto got her BA from Indiana University of Pennsylvania in psychology. She then went on to Texas Tech University in human development, getting her master's in 1981. And in 1984, she got her PhD from Texas Tech in human development. Between 84 and 93, she climbed through the ranks as assistant, associate, and then professor. And she was also coordinator of the gerontology program at the University of North Colorado in Greeley, Colorado. 1994 to 96, she was lured away to become associate director for a gerontology geriatric center at the Colorado Health Sciences Center in Denver. And, well, I would say lured away, we did it at the same time. Yeah. And in 1996 through 2016, she assumed the role of professor of adult development and aging in the Department of Human Development and Family Science at Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University. That's the correct name, not what's up on our slide.
Thank you.
in Blacksburg, Virginia. And 2016 on, she's the University Distinguished Professor and Director of the Institute for Society, Culture, and Environment. And she's also a senior fellow still. She's directing the Center for Gerontology at Virginia Tech. And she has secondary appointments in the Department of Internal Medicine and the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Medicine at the Virginia Tech Carilion School of Medicine. She's a very accomplished academic. She's a fellow of the American Psychological Association, the Gerontological Society of America, and the National Council on Family Relations. She's the recipient of the Gerontological Society of America Behavioral and Social Sciences Distinguished Mentorship Award, and the Gary Andrews Visiting Fellow Award from the Australian Association for Gerontology. Since 1980, she's had support from over $8 million in external grants from a variety of agencies: NSF, NIA, DHHS, NIJ, NCI, and ICHD, and the Alzheimer's Association. She's published over 200 scholarly articles and book chapters, and is editor and/or author of 14 books. Her research focuses on health and social support in late life, and includes studies of the health of rural older women, family relationships and caregiving, and the topic for today, elder abuse. She was actually one of the pioneers in this area. I refer to it a little bit later, but her work on elder abuse has examined several types of abuse and mistreatment, including sexual abuse of vulnerable older adults, intimate partner violence in late life, poly-victimization, and elder financial abuse and exploitation. I mentioned she's one of the pioneers. When I first started to look a little bit at that area, her work came up, particularly the work associated with the MetLife series of studies on financial abuse. She really was the person, with her colleagues, who put a face on financial elder abuse, and for the first time really provided detailed information for researchers, the public, and policymakers about the costs of this growing problem. And it's found in every community and among all social strata, as she's going to tell us. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Karen Roberto, Virginia Institute of Technology.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Neil, for that nice introduction, and thank you all for coming today. And particularly because it's not an easy topic to talk about. My husband said, why would you pick that, to do your talk on? But I think it's really very important, and it really brings together my work that I've done a long time on elders and families and communities. So what I hope to share with you today is sort of this connection that we're beginning to see or uncover about elder abuse and the opioid crisis. So we know that the prevalence studies in elder abuse suggest to us that 1 out of 10 individuals will experience abuse in late life. And so these are coming from national data, and we know that that number is underreported. These are self-report data. If we look at APS, Adult Protective Service, which in every state under various names, that is the agency that investigates elder abuse, if we look at those numbers, we see that it's likely to be very much underreported. In fact, the study out of New York suggests that the reporting type is going to, or the reporting prevalence is going to vary by type, but for every one report, there's probably 24 cases that are not reported. And while my work primarily focuses on the community elders living in their own homes or homes of relatives, we also see abuse in facilities as well. So it's important to recognize that there's different types of abuse, and so when today I'll probably talk collectively about elder abuse, but there are a multitude of ways that elders really are inflicted by abuse. But the bottom line is that when we think about elder abuse, we're thinking about an intentional action that causes harm or creates the potential for harm against the older individual. About 80% of cases of elder abuse occur in the family or by a trusted other, someone that the person knows. The rest by a stranger. Oftentimes picking the older adult because of a vulnerability that they detect. Although I must say, just this afternoon when I had a chance to look at my emails, I had a voicemail message. And they were coming after me for my Social Security. So I don't quite get Social Security yet, but those are the kind of scams that really frighten our seniors today. You in Florida are not immune. I was fortunate enough to get some information from your state office on aging about, or state APS office about elder abuse. And I just wanted to share that with you, that you can see that about 41,000 cases of suspected elder abuse for persons 60 and plus, and that's usually the age kind of cutoff that we use, occurred in 2018 here in the state of Florida, and the listing of the very different types. Self-neglect is often the most common type of abuse that we see in APS cases. It's not the type of abuse I'm particularly going to focus on today, but you can see how it plays out in other ways. So what puts an older individual at risk for elder abuse? I wish I had that answer, but from the literature and from our own work, we see that there's a variety of risk factors. And the one that, if I had to hone in on to say that there really is consensus, is about cognitive functioning. And so when we see individuals, certainly with mild cognitive impairment or dementia, their risk really escalates. But we also know that as we age, our cognitive abilities change. We process things slower. We have a more difficult time kind of dual tasking. And perps, or perpetrators of abuse, know this, and they play on that. So it's that make a decision, make it quickly, and it doesn't give a lot of time to process. So whether we're talking kind of this continuum of what we would call a typical older adult, or those with real cognitive decline, that's the one variable we all agree on, those of us that study elder abuse. The other variables depends on the study. Sometimes we see women being at risk more so than men. Then the question comes up, is that because there's more women in later life? Is it age? Well, I always think, as I tell my students, age is just a number. We really have to understand the context of aging. So when we say older age, is it really because I'm 75 or 85 or 95 years old? Or am I at risk because what typically is associated with the 85, 95-year-old is a decline in some area, whether that's physical, psychological, or social? Personality comes into play. There we have a very group of tenacious older adults. We are in a society where independence is very important. And so I'm not going to really talk about this because I don't want you to know that I might be a sufferer or a victim of abuse. Social support. So loneliness has really emerged in the gerontology literature in this last couple of years as a topic of interest really across the board. But we see that with elder abuse, that older individuals who report greater loneliness or social isolation tend to be at greater risk for abuse. And place of residence, and I mean this geographic place. So I study rural, I've always lived in rural areas, so that's kind of near and dear to my heart. But we have seen some unique attributes of the rural community that I'll get to a little bit later in my talk that may increase the likelihood or the risk for elder abuse. What about the perpetrators? What do they look like? Again, mostly they're people that the elder knows, so they're a familiar face. They have this ongoing relationship. They're able to kind of hide their abusive relationship. So you saw on the list physical abuse. That's the easiest type of abuse to see, but it really accounts for a small percentage of elder abuse. The psychological abuse, oftentimes the financial abuse, and neglect as caregivers is much more easier to conceal. Individuals who perpetrate abuse really are very good at cultivating relationships, and oftentimes they're seen by others as that good person. Isn't he a great son? He takes care of his mother, he's able to do that. Or the neighbor, or the banker, or whoever that might be. Oftentimes what we see is this dependent-independent relationship between the older adult victim and the perpetrator. So the perpetrator may be a family member or close associate who really is dependent on that older adult, whether it be for finances or shelter or emotional support. But conversely, the older adult also may have some needs that makes them reliant physically, cognitively, socially on the person who is actually abusing them. So it's a very complex relationship. Consequences and outcomes of abuse. There isn't any good outcome of abuse. As Neil referred to the MetLife study, we estimated that we lose about $3 billion to elder financial abuse alone annually. And that affects each and every one of us. Because when that elder's funds are depleted, really they're not in positions to be able to regroup those funds. So then it falls on families, it falls on communities, it falls on our government to really take care of individuals. We see greater illness, loss of productivity and so forth for older adults that are abused, much feelings of despair, fractured families when this occurs in families, and mortality rates. So there's been some studies that have suggested that, or really have shown that it's sort of the typical mortality rate of about 4.5 or so per 100 individuals at any given time. For a person who is abused, that raises to about 18.3 per 100. And so there really has seemed to be some relationship between early death for individuals that have experienced abuse. Now, there's a lot of factors that go into that, so the cause and effect isn't a one-to-one, but it just raises our attention about that. So, that's a little bit of background. Make sure we're all on the same page about elder abuse, and that could be a lecture in and of itself. But I'm gonna shift gears just a little bit to bring us all on the same page about this opioid epidemic that we're in the midst of in the United States. In 2017, it was really identified as a public health issue. And so we began to pay greater attention to what was happening in our country around opioids. A little bit of history, really, we're in sort of phase 3 of this epidemic. It really started early on where we saw in 1999 kind of the pills, the OxyContin really came into play, and it was the miracle drug. It was going to take pain away, there were limited side effects, so we thought, and because we were looking to treat pain. Older adults have a higher propensity for pain than other age groups. And so this was really going to be something that really could help not only older adults, but everybody. As we've seen, that hasn't been the case, and we're now in the midst of the big pharmas really looking at what they did and what they really did know about these drugs. But that's how this all got started. And then in the second wave, we saw the heroin increase. So that kind of came back into play from earlier times, and we began to see great deaths, or great number of deaths from heroin. And then now in this third phase that we're in, it's really the synthetic opioids, that the fentanyls and so forth, that is really causing the problem, and you see that uprise. And in a lot of ways, they're more dangerous than the pure opioids themselves, because people don't know what they're getting and so forth. So this isn't something that occurred overnight. It's taken a long time, and it's taken probably too long for us as a society to begin to really deal with that. It was always something that happened over there. So if we just look at the prescription opioids, in 2016, over 11.5 million Americans reported misusing their prescription pain medication. And about a third of older adults reported that they probably did not use them correctly. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody that takes opioids will become addicted to them, but it's a high enough percentage that it causes great concern. So when we look at death rates with the opioid epidemic, it really is quite startling. So that for the third time, In 2017, we saw actually a little bit of a drop in life expectancy. And all the public health people are saying it's related to the death rates of these opioids. And so if you look at these numbers, 1 out of 5 drug overdoses is related to opioids. Every day, on average, 30 Americans die as a result of an overdose from opioids. And so it's just a phenomenon that we haven't got our hands around. We are finally facing this as communities and really looking at how do we get our arms around this, and how do we prevent the addiction from occurring, and how do we treat individuals that are experiencing this epidemic. Again, bring it a little bit closer to you in Florida. Florida has become known as the ground zero for pill mills. And so particularly early on in that first wave of the opioid crisis, that we saw a lot of prescriptions being written that probably shouldn't. And even in 2017, Florida providers wrote 69 opioid prescriptions for every 100 persons living in the state of Florida. Outrageous. Right? And so we really begin to see certain pockets. So why so popular in Florida? You know this, it's your elderly population. And so the Washington Post had in the fall, early fall, was doing a study over time, and they picked on Florida for one of their stories. And what I found really interesting is that in some times, it's no longer occurring, but particularly in those early 2000s, that a particular airline would have direct flights from different parts of Florida to Ohio, to Kentucky, places where in small airports you probably don't have direct flights to, but they were really the pill flights. And that's how they were getting them back to different parts of the country. So unfortunately, you are not immune from the opioid epidemic, as is really no state in the country. The effect of opioids goes far beyond the individual that is affected by them and lives a life really fraught with all kind of problems. But it really cascades. So we talk about health problems of individuals, of their offspring, of their families. The economics of opioids is just one that really devastates communities for the cost, and that businesses don't come in because they can't hire enough people to pass drug screenings and so forth. So you begin to see that happening. Crime, there's some correlational work out there that shows higher crime statistics among the pockets of opioid, where opioid use and abuse is really high. And then what I'm really interested in is in the families. So we see an uptick in the number of families affected by the opioid crisis, and in particular, grandparents raising their grandchildren as a direct result of incarceration or just inability to provide care because of the addictions that they're experiencing. So it isn't a linear piece. That has this really cascading effect that cuts across all sectors when we think about something of this magnitude affecting our society. So, how do we put these two things together, and why? Well, I've been studying with my colleague, particularly Pam Teester, for many, many years, the whole phenomenon of elder abuse and various types of elder abuse. And we kept hearing stories about, the opioid crisis. It's really impacting the older adults. And so we were talking one day, and I said, no, this is going to sound bad, but I said, I'm really kind of not interested. I studied chronic pain earlier on in my career. I said, I'm not interested in going back to that. I'm sorry. And she said, no, it's not the older individual themselves that are addicted. They are. I mean, there are some. But she said, the APS workers, the Adult Protective Service workers, are saying they're seeing an increased cases, and these cases are complex. So that piqued my interest, and so we began to kind of play around with that. Well, one of the reasons that older adults sort of get set up for this, and I alluded to it earlier, is in fact they are opioid users, and so they have the pills, right? So many older adults experience chronic pain. About 29% of these individuals have prescriptions for opioid, and about 86% of those report keeping their leftover pills, and we know communities try to do the pill bags and they come get rid of that. But it really, we're pretty bad about hoarding pills. When I helped clean my family's house out when my mother moved to assisted living, my father had been dead a good 10 or so for a year, above the refrigerator in this cabinet, we probably could have went to jail. There was just so many pills there, or started our own pharmacy. It's like, oh, what are you guys doing? And older adults are the long-term users of the opioids. And so we're beginning, we see them set up, and then here's where women come into play, that women are more likely to be using opioids than are men. So we begin to see some demographic shifts in the abuse piece. So this led us to our work that I'd like to share with you. So the first study really was the prospectus of service providers. And so many of the service providers in our network that we know from other research that they've helped us with really believe that the opioid epidemic was associated with increased physical abuse, with emotional abuse, with financial abuse and theft, and so on. So we decided that this was something that maybe we needed to look into. And in particular, we were interested in opioid use in rural America. So if you look at the maps where you see high death rates, it's really in a lot of rural area, and high usage rates also in rural areas. And the opioid crisis is particularly rampant in the part of the country we live in, which is rural Appalachia. And so the communities have been hit really very hard with this crisis, and in doing community surveys, the residents say that they believe it has gotten worse in the last 5 years. So there's really some challenges to living in these kind of communities, and it's important to really think about rural not being as one place, but as kind of an umbrella for many different types of communities, where we have to take into consideration the traditions and the values and the customs and expectations in these communities. In Central Appalachia, where we're at, really strong familialism, strong sense of fatalism, strong sense of independence, are all very, very important. So the values and the circumstances become an important element for us to try to understand. There are also areas of low economics, high poverty rates, and low resources to help them out. So there's not a lot going for individuals in many of these communities. Pam's husband, who is a lawyer and practiced in Kentucky, talked about in eastern Kentucky where it was really a much better living selling drugs than anything that they could really find. Now you say, well, yes, but they're the circumstances. We won't be judgmental about that. So we went into this study just to really explore what the perceptions were, what did these communities, these rural areas believe that they were seeing, and how did this opioid epidemic really adversely affect the older adult. So we conducted phone focus groups in 4 states, and these were, quite simply hour-long. We got some sort of high-level individuals at the state level who had access to data and could give us sort of some sense of what their states were seeing. So you see here we have Kentucky, Ohio, Virginia, and West Virginia is where we talked to. And we had representatives from really very different groups who deal with elder abuse, APS directly, but also more peripherally in terms of substance abuse and mental health issues and law enforcement and social services. So we tried to get a good representation of those agencies or organizations that may or may not work together but are aware of what the issues were. And these states are kind of clustered together and have high opioid use. So we collected data and we coded it and analyzed it in good focus group form. And we tried to, as we were coding and listening to the interviews over and over again, to really try to identify what were they telling us? What were the primary themes? What did they find? So really 6 themes emerged from our data analysis. 1, the problem is escalating in scope and severity. So I put up some quotes there, I won't read to you, but so that you can kind of get a sense of this idea that there really was a strong belief across the states, we didn't really see one state jumping out over another, that in fact these cases were hard and they were seeing a lot of exploitation. And the worry was that the drug opened up the possibilities for other types of abuse. So there was really very concerned that as long as the drugs are available or the money to buy the drugs, that the older adult certainly was in danger in that they were neglected, they weren't getting the medications they should be getting, their money was being used for things that it shouldn't have been, but they weren't under any physical harm. Probably a lot of psychological abuse, but that's hard to substantiate. This was what they were believing was really happening. So the second theme, and this really comes from, again, all of them, but one person really described this way as an older adults are essentially prisoners in their own homes. So oftentimes they took in relatives who had fallen on hard times. And so maybe they were in prison, and so they had got out, they had no place to go, so they went to live, in this particular case, lived with the grandfather, and this grandson really exploited his grandfather under the guise of taking care of him until he really depleted the $85,000 that this man had to his name. And so it was a situation where there was this sort of codependency really going on. Elders often are in a position where they can't leave their homes, or they're afraid in their own homes. And so when the abuse occurs, others talked about kind of the people that the family member would bring into the home were kind of shady characters, and they weren't individuals that made them very comfortable, so they would go to their bedroom or they would stay afloat. The elder's home then also became a safety hazard, not only for them, but for the caseworkers and for the community. Caseworkers often talked about, or the respondents talked about caseworkers being afraid to go into these homes because of the kind of activities that were taking place. If they could get law enforcement involved, then there was a little bit better protection of just then the APS caseworker going into place. But you have to have some cause on why we're doing this. Again, we're not having the neon signs that's saying this, this is the place to get your opioids. But they became known in the community. The kind of offshoot that began happening in what APS would call self-neglect is that older adults were seeing cases or seeing reports of older adults really living in squalor, no electricity, no heat. And in investigating, they were finding that the funds were being diverted for the opioids and not used for the medications, perhaps, or not being used to buy, or being used, to buy the medications or to buy off the streets, and then not used to pay the bills and so forth. So then that put up some red flags for individuals who reported that something was gone awry in these homes. It doesn't just occur in the home. So older adults were also being exploited for their drugs in facilities. Now, not all APS has jurisdiction in facilities. So, but where they were seeing that sometimes staff members, took the medication off the carts. And when that happens, of course, that means the older adult doesn't get their medication. And so they're in pain when they really shouldn't be there. And you can see in this example of a woman who really had taken a lot of medication and was kind of found down the street. That's really the extreme. It's much more subtle than that, when, you know, a little bit's gone here, a little bit is gone there. So people are pretty smart about it. The fifth theme was that, but facility settings are not confined to nursing homes or other type of long-term care facilities. And we had much discussion around hospice because, again, the pills are accessible. And as family members or others know that, then the older adult, it sort of sets them up to be susceptible because they are getting more than what would be sort of typical in their everyday life. And so it isn't just in the routine care, but really in end-of-life care where they believe they were seeing cases. And finally, they talked about something that I really had not thought about, and that was that a service conundrum exists. So while APS could go in, and usually the older adult would say, oh, nothing's going on, I'm fine, and as long as they are cognitively able, they are adults, they have the right to make bad choices, and there's not a lot that they can really do. If they're in situations where there's where there's a financial issue, they can help to provide services. And that might be weatherization services or paying, supplementing the electric bill and so forth. But what that does is allows the perpetrator really to remain in the home with the older adult if that's where they're living. And so it's on one hand good. We don't want people living without electricity and heat. On the other hand, it doesn't break the cycle. So what we concluded from these focus groups was, in fact, that there's an increase in drug-related, particularly opioid-related exploitation cases. The problem is increasing, and they expect it to increase further. There's a lack of resources in the community to really come together to deal with this. This isn't one agency, oh, let APS take care of it. They can investigate, they can do care plans, but they need the community resources to be able to carry that out. And finally, there's no reliable data to really document the problem. Remember, these are focus groups. These are their perceptions, and of course, the kind of extreme cases are what often comes out in these kind of work. So as scientists, that worries us. Like, how do we get this data? It's not like, you can't do the random survey and get this information. So we were able to do the second study. And the reason we were able to do this is because Kentucky stepped up. And so we worked with Kentucky to really look at their cases of substantiated elder abuse over a 3-year period. So we were able to get de-identified case records from APS for 2015, 16, and 17. And in doing that, we were able to do some analysis about what does this look like in terms of opioids. We really framed our work around this issue of place, and how does place really intersect with this experience of mistreatment. And what I mean by that is that given the opioid epidemic in central Appalachia, where we're situated, where Kentucky is, we assume that there's some attitudes about drug misuse and under and unemployment and high rates of disabilities that often affect these families. And compared to other regions in the United States, and even in Appalachia themselves, people in central Appalachia are less educated in general. They have higher unemployment rates. It's estimated that less than 60% of people in the 25 to 64 year age range is actually in the workforce in this particular region. And so, not surprising, we have high poverty rates in this particular area. So we wanted to be mindful of that as we began to look at this data. So the purpose of this study really was to characterize substantial cases of elder abuse in 13 counties. And so if you see, it's the counties off to the east there, where perpetrators used opioids and that was part of the documentation. Now, just to give you a little aside, 3 of the top 8 counties that have the highest opioid distribution last year are in Kentucky, and one of those, the number 4 one, was in our study. So we knew we were hitting an area where this was really predominant. So the data that we have comes from the Assessment and Documentation Tool, or the ADT. And this tool is a universal assessment that is used in some variety by all APSs. But it's, when you work, for those of you that work with secondary data, it's not exactly what you're looking for, but it's the best that we have at the moment. And it really was not designed for research. And so there's 11 areas within that, and after the end of every area, there's a place for case notes. Well, in the ADT, there's not opioids as a risk factor. There is substance abuse, but that's big. That can be anything. So in addition to the actual number data, we were able to get the case notes that aligned with each one of those. And so it was only by looking at those case notes were we able to identify those cases that were documented. There's probably, we believe, and in talking to the supervisors, a lot more, but we were able to find 28 substantial cases of elder abuse in which opioids played a role. So we took those cases and we began then to look within those cases. Now, these case notes are not long things. They're, little paragraphs after each of these 11 areas. Hopefully, sometimes they're not there. But it's a step forward from having no empirical data and only having started out with researchers thinking this is probably an issue to hearing the perceptions of the workers. So now we have some empirical evidence of what's going on. So these 28 cases kind of broke down to 26 victims and 25 perps. And you say, how can that be? Your numbers don't add up. Well, we see a lot of poly-victimization where the perpetrator may be victimizing more than one perp, and we see more than one case of the same elder being victimized over periods of time. So that's why the little bit of differentiation. So what do they look like? Well, the older adults, this is a case where we really do see more females than males. They were on average 75 years of age. They were all white, so a limitation of our work. Eastern Kentucky, very representative of what we see in Eastern Kentucky. You can see that the older adults, the majority lived in their own homes, and the majority were widowed. When we look at the type of abuse, you see, again, multiple types. Because of the poly-victimization, again, the numbers don't align perfectly. So caregiver neglect, and that was often cited in cases because they weren't getting the medications that they were needing to have. Now here's a little bit of where it was a little more of a surprise to us. We'd heard exploitation, financial exploitation, and that's what we see sort of in general when we talk about substance abuse, that there's financial exploitation. But really that didn't apply as much here, in the sense that the exploitation was what would fall under the category of material exploitation. It was the actual medicines, the actual opioids that they were taking. It doesn't mean that money didn't kind of follow along that way, but it wasn't like in other cases where for alcohol or other that they were stealing money to buy those. And then some cases, few, of physical abuse. So what the perpetrators, pretty 50-50, half men, half women. 15 lived in the home of the victim. They were on average 35 years of age, again, all white. And then some were in caregiving roles, and by all means, I don't want to insinuate that caregiving and elder abuse are correlated, but oftentimes this interdependency between the perpetrator and the victim does exist. 3 were paid caregivers and 6 were not caregivers. The perpetrators, I may do this again, there. The perpetrators often had a criminal history, and that is somewhat common in the general elder abuse literature. So that, and some of these were perpetual offenders, where they had 13 on average criminal charges, and that could range from misdemeanors to felonies. But you see, there were other drug charges over the years. Again, these are only what got documented, and sometimes it doesn't, because it doesn't fit into the flow of the investigation. And as my graduate students who were helping to code all this data said, they got new investigators in 2016 because those notes are much better than 2015. And that's not to slight the workers. They're overworked. They have all these cases to deal with. So they get just the information down that they need to get down. They're not researchers. They're trying to build the case that they need to substantiate that. They also had a history of abuse. So this oftentimes was not the first offense. So after looking at these cases, we really came up with two overarching categories, this idea of exploitation and of dependency. And we used those categories as a way of understanding the cases. So we went back in, that was the sort of big picture, and then we went back into each case and we began to look at what are we seeing there? Are we seeing this kind of evidence? And it's not a yes-no type of thing. Most of the time on a continuum of that, but this was really our guiding way that we set up our coding. And so here's a summary of the finding. Embedded in all these cases was really some strong evidence of polyvictimization, this multiple abuse, multiple offenders, so forth. Another surprise from the data, the family physicians were actually actively engaged in identifying that something was wrong. And I mentioned this to someone the other day, and they said, well, but they can't really say, but they can report anonymously that they have some suspects. They suspect abuse, and then they can be followed up upon when a formal investigation is in play. So what was happening is that the older adult would go for their checkups, they would get their blood work and so forth, and there was a lack of evidence of the drugs that they were prescribed in their blood, right? So the docs, and we saw this in several cases, so keep that in the back of the mind, because they could be key players in here. Older adults themselves claimed, oh, it's not that big a deal, I'm fine, I didn't suffer from not getting any medication. Perpetrators often had a history of crime, you saw that in the quantitative data. And the older parents in particular often shielded their adult children from any form of investigation, sometimes to their own detriment. Not atypical in elder abuse, but we saw it here as well. So that's kind of a summary of our finding, and I want to give you just a few faces so you can really hear what these stories are about. So let me share a few with you. First, Noreen and Nevin. Noreen's son, Nevin, was, and these are all made-up names, was suspected of physical abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Noreen needed help with activities of daily living due to heart and kidney problems and some other chronic conditions that she had. Home health workers visited 3 mornings a week, and Nevin, who lived with her because he had no other housing, helped with household chores and with her medication. Now, the details of what prompted the allegation were missing from the reports that we have, but during the investigation, APS found that some of Noreen's pain medications were missing, and she was one of those that had tested negative for the Norco that she was prescribed. Nevin seemed sort of not engaged and was not really very concerned, and the staff really found no evidence to be able to substantiate that she was physically abused. However, allegations of neglect and exploitations, in this case taking medications, were substantiated against Nevin. When the APS workers reviewed Nevin's history, they found unsubstantiated caregiver neglect and exploitation cases back to 2008. In 2017, Noreen died in a hospice center where she had been transferred after it was discovered that the water and electricity had been cut off in her home. Prior to her death, again, drug screen showing she wasn't getting her medications. Nevin admitted to picking up the medications from the pharmacy and keeping them for himself. In addition, he used his mother's money to buy drugs rather than to pay her bills. But again, from the history, apparently, when Noreen failed drug screenings over the years, they would switch doctors. So it's not clear whether Noreen and Nevin had begun pill sharing about as far back as 2008, when Nevin initially came under scrutiny by APS. But it's certainly a possibility because in 2016, when this case was brought back up, she was certainly found capable of making her own decisions. So a little speculation on our part there. Let me share Fran and Fred with you. The first 2 times APS workers visited Fran and interviewed her son, Fred, they found evidence to substantiate exploitation, again, stolen medication, but not neglect. Fred had an extended criminal history of substance abuse. He lived in a trailer next to his mother's home, and he provided help for her. He was unemployed and dependent on Fran's income while he tried to obtain disability benefits. The 3rd time APS workers visited and found missing medication, Fran told them that she had flushed it down the toilet and the allegations of exploitation and neglect weren't able to be substantiated. The 4th and final investigation during our study period found both neglect and exploitation, and Fran had moved in with another family member. In the case of Paula and Parry, Paula had Alzheimer's disease and other physical ailments. Her grandson, Perry, helped with her care, including picking up her medications from the pharmacy. He came to the attention of APS when she did not show up for her doctor's appointments. At the time of the report, Paula had passed away, but when interviewed before she died, she denied that her grandson had mistreated her. And finally, the case of Edna and Edward. Edna had multiple chronic illnesses, including diabetes, and used a walker. She needed help with transportation and housework. Her granddaughter and adult son, Edward, moved in with her and were her caregivers. Upon investigation, again, missing medications, as well as insulin syringes. In addition, the APS workers uncovered that Edward was manufacturing methamphetamines inside his mother's home. Now, Edna said she was unaware of his business, but complained that he bought all kinds of characters into her home. Investigation of the case began when police pulled Edward over while returning home with from Edna's doctor's appointment. Edward was arrested for driving under the influence and possession of prescription drugs. Edna allowed the police, or gave the police permission, to search her home where they found the meth lab. So you begin to see this pattern here. Like other perpetrators, Edward had a history of crime and substance abuse and a codependency issue going on. So these are just some of the examples, and some of them we read because it was really hard to believe some of the situations that occurred. So what did we conclude from this? Well, we're seeing that an increased susceptibility of older individuals to opioid-related outer abuse. And oftentimes there's a heightened vulnerability because they've really opened up their homes and their lives to family members who have fallen on hard times as they see that, and who are then placed in a vulnerable position when, not always, the person isn't able to stay on the path to recovery. And often they find themselves in unreliable caregiving situations. And so the person they turn to for assistance, sometimes minor, sometimes much more major, aren't able to provide that care. And as a result, the older individual is really neglected. So, as Neil alluded to, it's important that we take our science outside of the rooms in which they're conducted and try to think about what are the implications of this particular work. Well, clearly there's a need for continued education, and we're beginning to see that. You know, we'll see what happens as the fallout of the drug company settlements, who by all accounts, seemed to have known what the opioid was going to do, that it did have the long-term effects that they were saying at the time did not. But we need education among older adults to really understand the value and the dangers of opioids, and how to manage their medications appropriately, but also for family members of what to look for when, in fact, there may be some belief that abuse is occurring, and encouragement to report that. But we have to understand the cultural norms in the communities that we're working in, to kind of bulldoze in and to really say we're going to make these changes probably doesn't work. And we really need a grassroots effort to really think about this. A new NIH award was just given to Columbia University to really begin to look at community-based interventions to deal not so much with the taking of the drug, but what happens in these communities. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over the years. My public health colleagues say their recommendations is that we really think about harm reduction strategies or campaigns, and it makes some sense to me. So where you're really trying to reduce the prevalence of opioid use, which has that cascading effect of reducing the abuse, because we know older adults really do not like to point the finger to their family members, and so they will deny, they won't report, and yet they are the ones suffering from that. So there may be other approaches and interventions that can be put into place that are more effective of trying to prevent and stop this type of abuse. From a research perspective, there's a lot of work yet to be done. We really need to conduct long, in-depth interviews. We need longitudinal work to try to look at this relationship between opioid epidemic and elder abuse, and really begin to try to untangle these individual and collective influences on what's happening. And then we do need to understand about older adults themselves who are addicted to elder abuse. I love my older adults, but none of us are saints in this room or in the people that I work with. And sometimes we make bad decisions. Older adults do too. And that's really an area very ripe and in need of research. So there's a lot, there's a dearth of empirical evidence. We're beginning to look at that. We really are the team that is the first that have any real data going on, but it's very preliminary at this stage. I am excited, however, to tell you that our next study is about to take off. And so we are working with the Administration for Community Living through a contract with their contractor WRM, where we'll engage in a national research study on this particular issue. So we were limited to the 13 counties in Kentucky. Now we will broaden that to at least 9 states across the United States, where we will do prospective collection. So we'll build, and we have built, I guess, a data collection form that as cases come in, that we get the kind of information that will certainly help them. We want to not impose burden on an already burdened system, but will help us have, from a science perspective, a better understanding of these cases. And then we will do case-specific follow-ups on depending on sort of what we're seeing in the data, to really get a more deeper understanding than what the case notes can provide us. So we're very excited to be starting this study. We should be in the field end of January or early February, and I guess I can just say stay tuned for that. So thank you very much for coming out today. I appreciate your interest, and I hope you are able to take away a few points in your own research or in your own lives, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Just a few questions, although we can continue over a very nice buffet of food out there. So please take advantage of our hors d'oeuvres afterwards.
Okay.
Questions?
Very nice talk.
Thank you.
Thank you, and especially for giving us in your introduction some points from Florida for us. I questions, but maybe answering only one will be enough. What are the main reasons, other than education, why the abuse, why the elders in rural areas are more subjected to abuse than in urban? And are there any urban studies?
Are there any urban?
Studies in the cities
Right.
comparable to yours?
Well, so the opioid crisis really started in the rural areas, and it was not until a few years ago that the urban areas caught up and actually exceeded the number of deaths in cases. That's not a good statistic to have if you're in an urban area. What we think about rural what we think about rural areas is that there's a lack of resources, and just the geographic distance in most, particularly in our areas, but that really holds true in the plains and other areas to really get to sources of help. And then I think the strong familialism is another issue that comes into play. But mostly, and this is just sort of my thinking from some of the rural studies that we've done, is there's a lot of stigma around abuse. Nobody wants to admit that their kid is abusing them. In rural areas, oftentimes, everybody knows everybody. And so I'm not going to speak up because, if I tell the police chief, he goes hunting with my brother-in-law who's going to tell this, right? And so the network that we think can be supportive also can be harmful to that. Now, how does that play out in an urban area? It may play out the same way, but we really we have few rural studies. Otherwise, people don't pay attention to place. What we hope to do in this next study is we've been very strategic in the states that we're inviting to participate so that maybe we'll be able to disentangle some of that. Good question. Other questions? Yes, Alice?
The cases that you told us about, to put the face on it, all happen to have male perpetrators.
I realized that today.
So do you have any just sort of your sense of patterns in female perpetrators?
Yeah, they're not much different. They're kind of they're interesting. I think we see, so the way Kentucky codes, they just call it adult abuse, and that can be, so they do physical, sexual, adult, and financial. So under this adult abuse is like the kitchen sink. So if you read through, my gut feeling is you see a lot more psychological abuse by the female perpetrators and a lot more intimidation. So let me give you one example of a female perpetrator. It was a granddaughter who was caring for or had some responsibility for her grandmother who did have dementia. So you can't put this all on the granddaughter, but here's her story. So she would take her grandmother to the dentist and tell the dentist, oh, her teeth, she's in pain, she complains about pain. And the dentist would give her the Percocet or some other type of opioid related. And then she would go to the next dentist. Or she'd go back to the dentist. It got to the point that she went to a dentist who pulled all of her grandmother's teeth. Now, there was no real evidence that that needed to happen, but you get a lot more pills when we're not dealing with that. And it was the stigma or the stereotype bias that this is an older person with dementia, they couldn't possibly tell me if they had any pain. I'm believing it was easier to deal with. So I don't know why I didn't pick that case to present, but it was really an oversight on my part. Other questions or comments?
If I may,
Well, how about if we do this woman in the pink first?
Oh, I was just going to say that for those who are in facilities,
Mm-hmm.
you find that family members just are pretty much totally unaware of any of this going on. Do you have any suggestions for maybe you'll be able to facilitate
Right.
ways to intervene on those situations
Well,
in the future?
I think that, again, sort of some of the cases, particularly in the first study, are sort of the extreme cases. So it's oftentimes very subtle. So I take your pills today and your pills tomorrow and yours the next day. And so, you miss one, maybe you're not feeling. So they're kind of crafty people. But I think that you have to be vigilant. Just because a person has moved to a facility doesn't mean your caregiving days are over. And so you need to kind of watch and listen to what the elder says. It's really easy to say, oh, she has dementia, or she has memories, so that she doesn't really recognize, and that's sort of the easy way out. And so what you always say to caregivers is listen to what they say to you and follow up on that. And you also want to look at signs like, so is a staff member always in the room when you're there and sort of doesn't let you alone with your loved one? That could be another sign. Again, that physical presence can be a little bit of intimidation. Oftentimes with the opioid misuse, the older adult doesn't necessarily realize it as much as if there's physical abuse where they're taking things, that the vase is gone from there, or there's physical abuse there. So it's a little easier to hide. Yes?
In terms of strategies, you mentioned, to address it, you mentioned education and cultural norms. I couldn't help but think about structural kind of changes, like changes to our long-term care system that would not put people in situations of such dependence on family members potentially, or economic or workplace.
Yeah, that'd be the ideal, right?
Right. Throw it out.
No, I think you're absolutely right. We shouldn't, and I think that's why it's a bigger picture than just the individual, but I think starting with the individual might be our best hope.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Please help yourself to some food on the way out. And Karen will be around to